Welcome back to the third episode of Adventist Peace Fellowship TV. And at the end of episode 2, I said I was going to address 3 different objections or protests to social action, social activism. But as I thought over those 3, I decided to split them up, and they've become 5. So today we are looking at 5 arguments against action, and I'm going to address these 5. I won't in any way be able to give a conclusive, lengthy, in-depth response. Just a few ideas on each of them. They're criticisms that I have heard and encountered personally and have had tried to think through. Anytime we do get criticism, it's worth listening to. We need to think through these ideas, the other side. And these are some of the ideas that I've come to. And so to get into this, I'm going to use a little help here. The first item on the list is we should avoid politics. Don't get into it. Now, I can definitely relate to this criticism. Let me give 2 examples at the end, either end of the political spectrum here. I went to one Adventist church, my old Adventist church, and in one sermon, the pastor, who was conservative politically, was talking about feminazis, and I did not go to church to hear Rush Limbaugh talk about feminazis. That was unnecessary. That's not what I'm looking for in church. And at the other end, I went to a church. It was a non-Adventist church. I went to another church with a friend from grad school, and that church was openly only for Democrats, specifically mentioning politicians, Democratic politicians. I don't think you could be a Republican and enjoy going to that church. So in that sense, I totally agree. So I definitely understand not wanting church to be left or right, Democrat, Republican. That's not what we're going to worship. That's not what we want to experience there. So what I advocate for, whether it's in the church setting or in the church community more broadly, is to focus on issues, not parties, not partisan politics. Because on any given issue, there might be a majority of people in one party that favor that, but there are people in the other party that do as well. And in each party, there'll be some people who disagree. So it's not about this party over that party. It's about the issues and who can we get on board to support this topic. If we believe an issue has biblical foundations, as if our study of the Bible leads us to believe an issue is important for us to bring into the public sector, then let's do it in a way that builds bridges, brings people together, doesn't divide and pretend like one side is all against the issue and the other side is all completely for. I advocate that we need to be bridge builders and bring together people who do already agree on this issue, and then try to bring together those who disagree with us. What are their arguments? Can they be brought on board? Not that we just want to push them away and talk down about them, but how can we bring them on board as well? So issues, not parties. And just as I'll add this, just as something about me personally. So I used to be a Republican. I'm now an independent. I'm happy to vote for people in multiple parties, local, state, national government. And so as an independent, I'm not looking for one party to be over another. I'm trying to humbly, because I can be wrong in all kinds of ways, but humbly to follow God and say, how would you have me address this issue? If somehow if I could see through my biases, if I could put away these other allegiances, what would you have me do? And so trying to approach it from a spiritual, from a religious standpoint, not just take these 2 binary options that this particular society has to offer. Also with this call to avoid politics, Clearly that was an important part of early Adventist history, and yet they were active. Ellen White calling to be active with voice, vote, and pen on certain issues, and religious freedom is an issue that we're involved highly in a political way. So I think the question isn't, should we avoid politics or be involved in politics? But the question is, how can we be involved in the political public sphere well? How can we do it in ways that honor God and in ways that are effective? So I hope that that would take a lot to unpack, to get into. That's not my point for this short video. Just to say the simple idea of avoiding politics, it's not consistent with our history. It's not consistent with what we are doing as a church with our religious freedom. And I don't think it's actually very realistic. So let's just work on doing it well, learning how to do that in God-honoring ways. So, number 2, the second argument that I sometimes hear about my activism, and I'm sure you get some of this as well, is as long as people can just call it liberal, then they don't have to listen to it anymore. Just cut out your liberal policies. I'll take environment as an example. Democrats are in some ways more known as the environmental party as opposed to Republicans, and that's incredible stereotype generalization. And then there's the Green Party beyond that. But instead of looking at that from what party you're in, how can we address that, look at that environmental issues as a spiritual faith issue from the scriptures? What do we see? What can we learn about the environment? And we should just have a whole episode just on the environment. But that it's an issue that should cut across political lines. So it's easy to call the environment, that's liberal, so don't talk about that. Because I think most of the people that I hear criticism from are coming from either Republicans or more conservative, and so this is the argument I hear more. Other people could make the argument, well, cut out your conservative policies, but this is what I hear more. But I don't think that the liberal conservative spectrum is actually very helpful for most of the issues, or for many of the issues that we address or that we talk about within Adventist Peace Fellowship. I mean, you take something like human trafficking. It's not liberal or conservative. That's a human compassion, human justice, human rights topic. They should cut across any political parties or the whole spectrum. It takes something as simple as eating a vegan diet. So on the one hand, you could have totally conservative. My grandfather was an Adventist pastor, very conservative, followed a strict Pritikin diet. So he's on this end. And then when I went to study at a Mennonite seminary, I met someone there who right away said, "Oh, you're from Andrews. You guys have an amazing vegetarian cafeteria and all these vegan options." And she's what I think in many ways we would consider very liberal. My grandfather and her would see differently on all kinds of different issues that we usually think of liberal and conservative. But when it comes to social ethics, you have the spectrum. You have the vegans at both extremes. You can think of nonviolence. You could have someone very conservative. I think we'd consider Desmond Doss a very conservative Christian Adventist, but he was against killing and war. And then today's a lot of what would be stereotyped as liberal people are against war. We're hoping that Obama, just speaking of the General Society of Public sphere, they were hoping that Obama would end some of Bush's wars, close Guantanamo. And then you would have others that have would have a deeper, more critical view of military in general, and how it's used in statecraft and empire, and would be against militarism there. At these two ends of of the spectrum. So we have this liberal conservative divide doesn't actually help us often think through the issues themselves, and so just labeling something as liberal so we don't have to listen to it, I think we can cut that out. Instead of labeling something as liberal, so ignore it, it's conservative, so ignore it, to look at the issue, get into the issue. I hope we can do better at that. Number 3, the third criticism. Similar to the last one, sometimes I hear people say, you're just talking about the social gospel, just cut that out. That's probably one of the most common ones I hear. But I think number one, we don't have a really clear concept of what the social gospel means, and number two, I think it's just ridiculous. So let's do a quick reading. Wikipedia, you can go into this in more detail in other books, but the social gospel. It was a movement in North American Protestantism which applied Christian ethics to social problems, especially issues of social justice, such as economic inequality, poverty, alcoholism, crime, racial tensions, slums, unclean environment, child labor, inadequate labor unions, poor schools, and the danger of war. It was most prominent in the early 20th century United States and Canada. Theologically, the social gospelers sought to operationalize the Lord's Prayer, Matthew 6:10, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." They typically were post-millennialists, that is, they believed the second coming could not happen until humankind rid itself of social evils by human effort. Its leaders were predominantly associated with the liberal wing of progressive movement, and most were theologically liberal, although a few were also conservative when it came to their views on social issues. Important leaders, Eli, Strong, Gladden, and Rauschenbusch. So obviously, Adventists, we do not believe the world will be perfected the millennium before Jesus comes. We believe that is after, that's not up to us. So we're not, no Adventist is pushing the social gospel, that social movement. Rather, what we're doing is looking at the social teachings of the Bible and trying to live those out, trying to embody them and figure out how to do those things today. So that article said that the movement peaked in the early 1900s, and we see that in Adventism, in my understanding of Adventist history and religious history in the United States, that when that split came and the more liberal churches were more heavily into what then was specifically the social gospel, and then the others, the fundamentalists, split and were more focused on saving souls, winning souls. That's the branch that Adventists went with. And so if you read about the early social history of Adventism, there's just so much there, that rich history, and then we veered away from it in many instances, not entirely by any means. But that's my understanding of how Adventism went with that more fundamentalist save souls for heaven. And that idea of the social issues in the Bible, if you want to get into that more, our podcast, episode 15, Dr. Pedrito Maynard Reed, he's the chairperson of the board, chair of the board for Adventist Peace Fellowship. He had a great presentation. Check that out. And then also I wanted to read a little bit from the Upside Down Kingdom. In one of the earliest chapter, he looks at 5 different ways that we detour around Jesus. And one of them speaks to this, Detour 4, Jesus only spoke of spiritual things. So a few highlights from this section. A 4th detour often softens Jesus' teachings by spiritualizing them. Human communities sort words into boxes. And in religious circles, the term spiritual tops the sacred ladder, but the word social slips to the bottom. Spiritual realities, the logic goes, come from God. They are holy. Social realities, on the other hand, come from people, and being far from God's heart, social realities are suspect. But against this, he says, God's love for the world produced social action. God didn't just sit in a great theological rocking chair and muse about loving the world. God acted. God entered social affairs in human form. Through Jesus, God lived in a real social environment. Jesus, in essence, disclosed God's social habits. In the incarnation, the spiritual became social. The genius of the incarnation is that spiritual and social worlds intersect in Jesus Christ. Again, he says we don't have two gospels. We don't have a spiritual and a social gospel, a salvation and a social justice gospel. Instead, we have a single, integrated gospel of the kingdom. This gospel fuses social and spiritual realities into one. Jesus binds the spiritual and social into an inseparable whole. Jesus argues that faith in God is always expressed in tangible acts of love for the neighbor. And to conclude this section, to ferret out the social implications of the gospel isn't to depreciate or neglect spiritual insights. It simply means that spiritual insights always have social implications. The integration of social and spiritual into a whole affirms an incarnation that moved beyond the Holy of Holies in Jerusalem, in the Jerusalem temple, to the social realities of Palestinian society. One way that Chris Blake has tried to get away from these labels that people can throw on is to use the terminology of biblical social responsibility. That what we're trying to do is live out the Bible's social claims, social ethic, the Bible's ethic to love enemies, to love our neighbors as ourselves. And so if we focus on that biblical call and not worry about labels like social gospel. So this type of language, biblical social responsibility, is calling us to focus on Jesus, focus on the biblical teachings and live those out, and not worry about labels like this, but simply trying to follow Jesus in the world today. Next, number 4, an argument I hear is that social action is futile, peacemaking is futile. It's a waste of time. You're just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. The whole thing's going down. Why are you wasting your time? You can look at verses like the poor you'll always have with you, or in the end there'll be wars and rumors of wars. So if there always be wars, always be poverty, like why waste your time? There's something better you can do, something more important you can do with your time, something more productive. And that logic is so it's so strange to me. Because we don't use it in anything else within Adventism. Like we don't say you'll never stop all ignorance, so why waste your time in education? Or you'll never eradicate all diseases, so don't go to medical school. Why do we have medical doctors? You'll never end it all. We don't say that. Why? So why would we say that about peace themes, about justice themes? They do matter, even if we aren't completely 100% successful in eradicating them. I don't think any of us have that grandiose a view of our ability to affect change in this world, that we can stamp out all injustice or all of a single type of injustice. That's beyond us. We know that, but the point isn't can I do away with everything, but can I make some difference? Can I impact someone's life? And this book, The World Is Not Ours to Save, the author's Tyler Wiggs Stevenson. It's a really great book. I really recommend it. He talks about his own journey to faith. He was already an activist, and just how overwhelmed he was just with nuclear issues. And part of the story is about him coming to grips with his inability to rid the world of nuclear weapons. And but what he came to when he became a Christian is that it doesn't mean that we stop. It just means we trust that it's in God's hands, and we just need to be faithful to do our part. What can I do? What's in my sphere of influence? It doesn't matter. The whole big picture is in God's hand, but how can I be faithful to what God has called me to how I can use my gifts to engage? So check out that book. I think it's great. Very, very good. Thank you to my father-in-law for giving me that one. Along those same lines, a chapter I want to highlight in the book, Do Justice. It was a compilation that has a lot of great chapters, a lot of really good material. I'll just quote from my chapter a little bit. So my chapter is called The Deck Chair Shuffle. You can see how that fits in here. The Deck Chair Shuffle, Justice and Adventism. And part of what I argue in here is that our Adventist theology of the Great Controversy, that should give us a model for what we need to be doing, because Jesus didn't just speak a solution, that he came to demonstrate God's character. And that was the response to Satan's claims about who God is. And I believe that we are called to the same thing in this great controversy. Now is our chance to put God's character on display. How can I get past myself to humbly do that? That God's compassion, that God's justice, that God's mercy and peace can be on display for the world in tangible, real ways, whether that's at the personal level or a societal level. How can I do that? So I do want to point that out. The big picture, it's in God's hands. How can I be faithful to what I need to do, to what I've been called to do, what I can do? Okay, so that brings us to number 5, the last thing on the list. Number 5 is, this is all a distraction. We've got more important things to do. You're out talking about peripheral things that are keeping us from the church's mission. Stop distracting us. And this ties in to some of the different things we've already covered, some of the social gospel themes, like don't get distracted with that. We need to be saving souls. We've got important work. The church's mission does not need to be distracted with things with peace and justice. And what is this? And obviously, I really disagree. That I don't think it is a distraction. In Chris Blake's model about central versus peripheral, I believe it is central to God's character, to God's throne, to God's kingdom, to God's people, to what God is doing in the world today. And I believe it's even central to that thing that people want to do of evangelism, of winning souls. And I'll just quote from Ellen White. I'll just quote one line from my chapter. So this quote from Ellen White I include here. There's a lot more. I'll put in the show notes on the blog and here on YouTube a link to another set of materials on Ellen White and social ethics. But here's one specifically on the mission of the church and the gospel. She says, "It is only by an unselfish interest in those in need of help that we can give a practical demonstration of the truths of the gospel. Much more than mere sermonizing is included in preaching the gospel. The union of Christ-like work for the body," all of our body needs, all those things, "and Christ-like work for the soul is the true interpretation of the gospel." It's not a distraction. It's central to conveying the true interpretation of the gospel. So she says a lot more about it. If you're surprised that Ellen White is speaking about social themes, check out the link I mentioned. I'll put it in here. And check out her book, Welfare Ministry. I know compilations have a bad name, but if you really don't think she spoke about social themes, check out that, and you'll just see how much, in how many different books she does cover it. Very powerful. So those are the 5. I hope some of this has been meaningful to you. In no way do I think that this answered and completely solved those criticisms, because there are important truths in those criticisms, things that we need to think through, wrestle with, take seriously. But in my view, they don't carry the day. They're partial, they're incomplete, and they're just such important reasons why they shouldn't stop our social action, social engagement, our work for peace and justice in this world, our small, sometimes seemingly insignificant efforts, that everything matters. So those five arguments against action are what I've heard the most, what I wanted to share. That will do it for this episode. So if you like this episode, give it a thumbs up, share it with people who also might find it interesting or engaging, and Let me know what questions you would like addressed in other episodes. I've got a list of topics that I've been working out, but want to hear from you, what you would find interesting and engaging, and I'll do my best to look into those, to have a little discussion together. So thanks so much, and until next time, grace and peace.